All right, the content in this video is important. That's why we've got a video to start with. We're going to introduce the big enchilada to you, the Australian Core Skills Framework, the Acsf, and this is really a critical piece in the puzzle. You may find you watch this video 2 or 3 times, not necessarily straight away, but maybe as a refresher later on in the course, just to come back to it and just capture the essence of what's in this video. So let's talk to you about the Acsf. On the screen at the moment, you can see the big red book with the number 5 on it. It is called the Big Red Book. It lays down the framework of the Acsf. The Acsf isn't a group of people. It's not an organisation. It's a framework. It's basically that big red folder of material. It's a framework all about Australian core skills. And when we talk about core skills, we're talking about language, literacy, and numeracy skills. Let's break it down. Let's have a dive inside the big red book and talk about what's there. The Acsf describes the 5 core skills, and they're considered essential to participate effectively in society. It provides a common reference point for describing and discussing performance in the 5 core skills. So when we talk about these 5 core skills, they're technical terms as far as we're concerned within the Acsf, within the framework. So whenever we're talking about them, we're referencing their definitions and explanations and the content that's in the big red folder. All right, so what are the 5 Acsf core skills? The first one is learning. Now, you might be a little surprised. You might be there thinking, I thought this was going to be about language, literacy, and numeracy, and all of a sudden, we've got learning. It was a bit of a surprise to some people, maybe, when the Acsf considered learning as one of the 5 core skills for language, literacy, and numeracy. But it was clever. Because often when it comes to people's ability to participate in training or adapt to new skills in the workplace, it might not be their literacy, their numeracy, their language per se that's the problem, but their ability to learn. So what was considered when the Acsf was put together was, let's not leave learning outside the scope. Let's bring it into the fold and let's consider it as part of the Acsf. So what is learning? Well, learning is a person's awareness of themselves as a learner and their skills to direct their own learning. It's each individual's person ability to learn. Are they willing to learn? Are they ready to embrace learning? Have they exercised the little muscles that allow them to learn? Are there blockages? Are there gaps? Are there problems in the way they think about things that inhibits them from learning? You've probably met people who've said to you, things like, oh, I'm too old to learn, or, I'm not interested in learning any things, or I'm scared of change, or, I know my job, I don't need to learn anything new, or I'm very experienced, I've been doing this job for 30 years, I don't need to learn anything new. When you hear things like that, little alarm bells go off in my head, because they're telling me that that's a person who has challenges with learning, as opposed to somebody who's a lifelong learner, who's committed to learning new things over and over and over. So learning is a very important part of the Acsf. It's one of the 5 core skills. And the other 4 are more straightforward. So let's have a quick peruse of those. The next one is reading. Now, you could have probably guessed that one of the core skills was going to be reading, and that's a person's ability to make meaning of different texts and types of writing. Can they read? And it's not just the ability to read the words, but it's the ability to comprehend words and make sense of it and to understand the written word. And that could be written words in books, or could be written words in a digital format, such as on a computer. The next one of the Acsf core skills is writing. And writing is a person's knowledge and skill concerned with the ability to shape written language according to the purpose, audience, and the context. So it's their ability to write in context and in a way that makes sense to the audience to whom they're writing, about the content, about what they're writing. Next one is oral communication. It's the ability for people to communicate orally. And that's a person's ability to use different styles of language appropriate for the purpose, participant, subject matter, and channels of communication. Oral communication is talking, but it's also listening as well. And some people say that when it comes to oral communication, we've got 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. Listening is a very important part of being effective in oral communication, and that's reflected in the ACSF as well. And the 5th of the ACSF core skills is numeracy. And numeracy is a person's skill in using mathematics to make sense of the world. The world. Stick that L in there, Damien. We all know about mathematics. How good are we at maths? Some are better than others, but our ability to use maths in our daily lives and in our work, that's numeracy. So they're the 5 core skills. In order, I think we had language, then reading, then writing, then oral communication, and numeracy. And you can see that with the exception of perhaps the first one, which is a bit of a wild card inclusion, the learning, that the others are very logically related to language, literacy, and numeracy, and LLN. So what we do with the ACSF is we acknowledge these 5 core skills, but not only do we acknowledge them, but we also measure them. And in order to measure them, we need more detail in the framework than just identifying these things. We need a structure for how we measure these core skills, for either measuring it for the purposes of an individual's LLN abilities, or the LLN specifications of training, or the language, literacy, and numeracy that's required to do a job and be effective in workplace performance. With all these things in mind, there's a structure and there's details within the ACSF to enable us to do that. Cue the next slide. Here are the key features of the ACSF and how it's organised to measure those 5 core skills. Now, we just introduced 5 core skills to you, but there's also 5 levels of performance. And the 5 levels of performance apply to each of the core skills individually. So we don't measure somebody's level of performance in the ACSF as a level 3 for all of their LLN capabilities. No. We measure their ACSF core skills individually. They get a score for learning, a score for reading, a score for writing, a score for oral communication, and a score for numeracy. So they get 5 scores. And those 5 levels of performance, those 5 scores, if you like, we'll explain those to you in a moment and show you what those numbers are. Now, there's also 4 performance variables. That's how we actually go through the process of measuring the performance. So in assigning the levels, we need a basis, we need a structure to make that assessment, and that is done using the 4 performance variables. And on a broader scale, there's 3 domains of communication. So some people might be good in some of the domain or one of the domains, but not good in the others. Well, this will make more sense once I show you the level of detail involved here. So let's step back a second and let's look at the 5 levels of performance. Now, before I show you the numbers of the 5 levels of performance that we use to measure the ACSF, I need to have a little disclaimer. And this is for the advanced learners and the people who already know a lot about the ACSF. If you're not very familiar with the ACSF, just have a little snoozle for 20 seconds while I give the disclaimer. For those of you who are very experienced with the ACSF or have experiences of in the past, you may be aware that there are actually 6 levels of performance instead of 5. This is not a mistake by Mr. Wedd. It's simply a recognition that we want to keep things relatively simple at this stage. Hence, we're just looking at 5 levels of performance. We will introduce the mystery 6th level at a later stage during this course. I promise. The disclaimer is over. Let's resume at normal transmission. There are 5 levels of performance that are critical to measuring the ACSF. And they're pretty logical. They go from level 1, which is low, to level 5, which is super awesome. So what we do is we measure each of the 5 core skills against those 5 levels of performance. We decide a number. So whether we're looking at a training specification or we're looking at an individual person's abilities, we ask ourselves, how good is their learning? How effective is their reading? How good is their writing, their oral communication, their literacy? And we assign a score. That score comes from 1 to 5. Sound simple? So people as an individual can get a score for their reading, for their writing, for their learning, for their oral communication, and for their numeracy. Each of those scores will be either 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. They might be fantastic at reading. They might get a 4. They might be lousy, really, really poor at numeracy. They might get a 1. Okay. How's it coming together? Is this making sense to you so far? I hope so. If you're a little bit lost already, you can always go back to the start of the video. But if you're still with me, let's talk about the 4 performance variables, because that's the way we measure and the way we decide what the levels of performance are going to be. And those 4 performance variables, as shown on the screen, are support, context, text complexity, and task complexity. So we tend to look at those individually, the level of support that someone requires with their LLN capabilities, the context and their ability to apply LLN and use their skills across a range of contexts, the text complexity that they can handle, and the complexity of the tasks that they deal with. We look at those 4 things, and that's what we use to help determine whether they're a level 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 for each of the 5 ACSF core skills. Okay. Now, each of the things that you're seeing on the screen here, we break down even more as we go through subsequent training here with you. Okay. This is an introduction at this stage. I don't expect you at this stage to understand all this perfectly, but I'm introducing these concepts and trying to give you a feel how it all fits together, so that as we introduce and give more detail to each of these components, that it will ultimately make sense to you. Now, the 4 performance variables, the 5 levels of performance, how are they assessed? Well, they're assessed against 3 different domains of communication, and we might choose just one of these for the purpose of an assessment at any stage. And they are personal and community, workplace and employment, and education and training. And some people might be stronger and might have higher performance levels with one or more of the domains than the other ones. For example, in personal and community, somebody might feel very safe, when they're dealing with their personal lives and their community, and might have fantastic reading skills for what they do there. But suddenly put them in an education and training setting where they're being really challenged on an academic level, and their ability to read isn't as good in that situation. So that's how the 3 domains of communication exist. They're there to help us determine the ACSF performance levels for different purposes in different contexts. All right, one more slide to go with this video, and this is the pretty slide. The pretty slide sort of shows the whole thing again, but in a different way. Over on the left-hand side, you can see the 5 ACSF core skills: learning, reading, writing, oral communication, and numeracy. In the middle, you can see the levels. That's the numbers we come up with. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Which one's the highest? Which one's the best? 5. Which one's the lowest? 1. Okay. And I've also on the slide there, it says plus indicators. That's just covering everything. That's another term that we'll be introducing shortly in terms of how we do the calculations. We use indicators. We'll show you more detail about that shortly. The measurements of how all this takes place uses 4 performance variables: support, context, text complexity, and task complexity. And the measurements can take place within one or more of the domains of communication: personal and community, workplace and employment, education and training. Okay, that's pretty much the end of the video. At this stage, your head might be starting to swell a little bit, might be going kapow. That's okay. That's probably normal, to be honest. So don't worry about that too much. You might want to watch this video again, just try and make a little bit more sense of it. Or otherwise, once you've got a bit of a grip on this, move through to the subsequent training slides and materials, and we'll reinforce each of these things so it makes crystal clear sense for you. You don't need to understand it all now. This is a lot to take in, but we want to introduce all these concepts to you. And now we're going to go through each of them one at a time and introduce them to you in more detail as we move through subsequent content. Good luck.